Hello, and welcome to this episode of BKAT Presents. Joining me is NAACP Local President, Tracy Flood. Tracy, it's so good to see you today.
You too, Constance. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I think it's such an important time for us to be having conversations about the hard work that the NAACP is doing right now. To kick things off, I'd love for you to start by giving us just a little bit of background about the mission and history of the NAACP itself.
Happy to. I think I want to start with basically explaining and telling people the NAACP is a nonpartisan organization. It is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's what NAACP stands for. And our mission is to secure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and to ensure the health and well-being of all persons. That's our overarching mission. And we do this through our vision and dealing with equal rights when there's discrimination based on race. Our overall objectives as the NAACP is grounded in our mission statement and broken out into educating the public of the adverse effects of racial discrimination and seeking ways to basically ensure a person's constitutional rights under lawful action. They can be secure in being able to carry out the furtherance of their objectives. And those are all things that we have set out in our articles of incorporation. So understanding that the NAACP as a national organization seeks to do this through enforcement of federal, state, and local laws. And we're here today as me being president of our local branch, Unit 1134. And we cover all of Kitsap County. That's from Bainbridge to southward, and also into Jefferson County and down into Mason County on the peninsula, because we're the closest branch.
And how long has the branch been in Kitsap County?
We just celebrated, well, I should say we would be celebrating this month in June, our 77th anniversary.
Fantastic.
So we had a big celebration of our 75th a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the national organization has been around since 1909.
Wow. And doing such important work.
Yes.
What does it feel like to be in your position right now during what I would call a racial pandemic?
Well, it's kind of compounded because we are in a national pandemic. COVID-19 is a national pandemic. We're seeing across the U.S. the adverse effects on the African American community, on the Hispanic community, as well as the Native American community, that this is hit hard. And our national campaign, We Are Done Dying, speaks to what's happening in every area. And it's that campaign came about right on the cusp of what's happening on the national level with the protest. And locally, we've seen our youth mainly activate protest in Port Orchard, Bremerton, Silverdale, Bainbridge, and wanting to be heard and seen. And so you've got a health crisis that rose into addressing racial disparities and racial bias and racism in America, compounded by health issues that also see the same systemic effects because of how the African American population is treated in by physicians and in hospitals, and the lack of hospitals in certain neighborhoods. So it's a compounding thing right now that this is all stewing at the same time, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, especially on a local level, to be able to say, we're in phase 2 as far as the pandemic is concerned, but it's also phase 2 of, can our leaders, can our law enforcement leaders, can our governmental leaders answer the call on addressing systemic racism that exists in America?
Mhm. And I know that you started a very important part of that conversation by collecting many of those leaders in both law enforcement and politics into a collective Zoom call recently that I was able to be part of. Thank you. Um, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that and how that went?
So on, I believe it's May 31st, I issued a press release statement that was basically in support of our NAACP branch that's in Minneapolis, and also challenging our law enforcement and our leaders here in Kitsap County to have a conversation, to basically address the issues that exist, because we are not immune in Kitsap County to issues with our law enforcement agencies. And it's one in which we can either rise to the challenge, or things can get to a level where they're out of control. And it's best to be proactive versus reactive. While the protests are reacting to what's happening around the US, there's also a need to address policy that can put into place reforming policies, as well as changes as to how things are done, and to not be afraid to use strong language. If you're saying that it is a policy that these tactics, a knee hold, or treating a person in your custody with care, as when it's non-life threatening, if those are things that are unacceptable in the training that all officers seek, and it's against policy, then language that says we ban neck holds, we ban above the neck restraints under these conditions. That's important to the community. That's important overall to see that these tactics are unacceptable. How are the tactics then tracked if you have an officer that breaks policy, that uses excessive force over a number of contacts with the public, and especially the African American community? That is a small number makeup in Kitsap County compared to Pierce County, compared to Seattle, compared to cities like Los Angeles, Baltimore, Chicago. But that doesn't mean that we're immune to the same abuse, to the same use of tactics that should not be used, to the same profiling that goes on a national level. So that's kind of where I put the call out, and our law enforcement leaders did respond to the call. And that was a start of a conversation that we know would not have all of the answers, but from there, taking additional steps to have accountability, to find out from that conversation if any changes have been made. And that's our job at the NAACP, is that accountability piece, policy making, and changes that works in conjunction with the protests that have been happening.
Mm-hmm. Utilizing that momentum to move us forward as a nation.
So I think the unfortunate thing is Mr. Floyd was murdered. Um, and then since then, we've had another incident in Atlanta. So until we can come together as a whole, um, and have leadership that says this is an issue, and using language that addresses the issue, that doesn't skirt around it, gloss over it, and is really important. And that's legislation that needs to come out of Washington, D.C., as well as on a state level of each state, and then each city from there. So there's that trickle down that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What were your feelings about that meeting, how it went, and how things look as we move forward?
My feelings are still being assessed, because it's one thing to be put on the spot to answer questions in front of a group that's watching you. It's another thing to take those words and then put them into action. And the meeting was held on Friday, June 5th, which was a part of our the NAACP's Vital Communications working group that has been basically was put in place as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We started meeting the end of March, and it was to make sure that the vulnerable populations in our communities were not left behind, that they were getting the communication pieces that they needed regarding the pandemic, when you have so many that are not online, that don't have Facebook, that don't have cable or Wi-Fi, high-speed internet, because not only is it a money issue, but it's also an access issue. So many, we only have so many providers inside of Kitsap County, and you're even more limited in Port Orchard, or if you're in Port Orchard, between Port Orchard and Bremerton, you're really limited. So there is so much as to access to vital communications that we felt the need to address. And when this happened, we set that meeting for that Friday group regular call, and basically answered the call to say that what's happening around the U.S. and even in Kitsap, from things, incidents that have happened, familiar with Posbo, with Chief Stick, the investigation there being local. So they're all intertwined from the standpoint of, how do we communicate with our community? How does law enforcement communicate with our community? All of these things being linked together. And so that's kind of where we thought would be the best way to initially address it, and take it on as a task in our smaller group, because we knew, as the local branch, we meet the fourth Mondays of the month, of every month. And to get a general body meeting scheduled sooner was a lot more difficult. And letting the time pass, we felt it was more of a priority to address it as soon as possible, and to have that initial conversation. And since that June 5th meeting, there was also a PAC meeting, which is run in conjunction with PYA, and an officers community meeting that's been around. PAC's been around about 8 years. And between the two of those meetings, Zoom meetings, I am happy and to be able to share information that our local prosecutor did issue a letter to our legislators, saying that, as far as understanding how the public can see the conflict that can arise if our local law enforcement, our prosecutors are also law enforcement, they carry badges, is investigating another law enforcement incident, and handing that piece of investigation over to the Attorney General's office, because the appearance of conflict in a community should be addressed. You may think that you're just doing your job, but from the outside looking in, how is there accountability if you just issued Officer J a warrant, and 2 weeks before that, you and Officer J had dinner? So it's a small community, and it's easy to begin to see where there can be community and mistrust. Addressing the trust issue and everything that's happening, even the COVID-19, people trusting what the government is putting out. Is this a conspiracy? You know, all of those things ultimately get back to building trust through communication in our communities as a whole.
Mhm. You touched on this just a little bit about the difference of being in Kitsap County versus these more urban areas that have much bigger populations in general, and therefore a much higher population of Black people or any people of color. Where in Kitsap County, we're seeing it's much more rural, we're much more separated from those areas, and there's a smaller percentage. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that relationship, and I think you just touched on that, how that relationship, it's almost an opportunity to have a different sort of conversation because the population is smaller, because we all know each other,
Yes.
because we are all so interconnected. It's a real opportunity, I think, to create a positive relationship because we know each other.
And our local branch of the NAACP has tried to take advantage of the unique structure of our community. While we're one of the larger counties because of how widespread we are, and the fact that Bainbridge is included in Kitsap, not Seattle. Some people still think relate Bainbridge to Seattle. But from Bainbridge, again, to the south end of Kitsap County, when you put it on a scale as far as numbers, you do have King County, Pierce, and I think we rise above Spokane. But we're pretty close. Spokane and Kitsap are pretty close as far as a third and fourth. Large scale. Because of the uniqueness and how we're set up as far as how Kitsap County, our environment is set up, as well as how the county is stretched throughout so much of the beautiful Northwest land, you know, including our tribe, the Suquamish tribe. It allows for there to be relationships that can be built. And it's taken some time. I've been here 30 plus years. And there was a time where there couldn't be conversations with law enforcement. And many of our young African Americans were targeted at a high rate. You had some leadership positions that were not amenable to conversations. But in the last 4 years, the NAACP has had a community dinner with law enforcement officers to help build those relationships. Because if you're working in a community, you want to know the people you're protecting. You want to know the people who's your neighbor. A lot of officers in the bigger cities live outside of Seattle. They live outside of the city. And that makes it harder. They may be somewhat in King County, but it's easy to be an officer in King County and live in Snohomish County. So the relationships in the bigger departments, as well as Pierce County, many times you see the officers live as far as Puyallup and even down in the Olympia area. So a lot of our officers do live within our community. Many may live just outside of Gig Harbor, but it's even some people think Gig Harbor's a part of Kitsap. So that being an aside, but it has allowed for us the last 4 years to be able to sit down, have dinner in a safe environment, not only for the officers, but for our members, to be able to feel comfortable enough to challenge the thoughts and to share the fears that we have for our children. So these dinners have allowed for parents to share and for the law enforcement officers to see the total difference in them going off to work and getting a kiss goodbye, come home safely, and an African American father, mother, myself saying, when I send my child out, I tell them I have to give them specific instructions on how to respond if they come into contact with law enforcement. That officer doesn't have that conversation with their teenager or their child or their wife. You know, it's totally different. So what we've been able to do with our annual community dinners is to bring it to a level where they have an example, a person that they can identify with. Father A, African American, engineer, 2 sons. Father B, white male officer, 2 sons. They both have jobs. They both leave their homes with totally different instructions as to what they have to tell their children. And the thought would never even cross the officer's mind to tell his children how to behave with law enforcement. And many saying, well, if people would just not, break the rules and would be law-abiding citizens, it's a lot more involved than that. Mm-hmm. It has to speak to how each individual is raised. This goes back in our history to before slavery. There's so much that's there to unpack. But these conversations that we've been able to have locally, in partnership with Olympic College, so I'm grateful for our relationship that we've had with the culinary program at Olympic College during these years to support these dinners. But to allow for these conversations to take place, I think has helped and improved the relationships that we've had with our law enforcement officers over the last 4 years.
I think, as you said, that's so important to be able to offer what this experience looks like for different families. You've touched on exactly how systemic that racism is and how it infiltrates every aspect of our lives, every aspect of our community. For the Black community to be disproportionately affected by COVID leads right into that. And it is easy as a white person to put our blinders on and ignore those things because they do not personally affect me. If I want to live within my tunnel vision, I don't see it. What I do see is the experiences of other people when I can take my blinders off and listen to what the genuine experience is of other people. We don't have all the same experience, any one of us, regardless of the color of skin. And then you start adding in all these layers of everyone's background, and it's different. Our experiences are wildly different. And I would even say, especially living in some place like Kitsap County, that is pulled away from the urban environment. We just have less people. We got a lot more trees. So things are
a lot more trees, lot more spread out. And that even delves into understanding that because we are more rural, we are more spread out. We don't have as many apartment buildings or high-rise buildings. We don't have that. We we don't have that one area in Kitsap County where you can say this is like this. What used to be in the Central District by the African American Museum in Seattle. You don't have that one neighborhood to point to, that one area to go to in any of our cities.
Right.
We are intertwined in our neighborhoods. We have military, we have retired military, we have those that work for the government, we have those that work for the Navy side of the government, the city side of the government, the county side. We have so many that commute to Seattle. Everybody should be working from home now, but still, but when you look at that, and then our communities are so fluid, always changing, because there's always military coming in and out. There's always government contractors coming in and out from all over. So that puts us in a very unique place. And also understanding that the history of Kitsap County, there, when the shipyard first came about, there were communities created for African Americans because of the segregation of the communities that took place. That no longer exists, but the populations were a lot higher. There's still challenges inside of our government entities with diversity, and how do you address diversity issues, and how do you address issues that come up of workplace harassment, workplace bias. All of those things uniquely affect how they're addressed in Kitsap County. So we have these conversations so that, again, trust can be built. Trust isn't just automatically given, but trust can be built. And that's on both sides. But when you have life being taken from so many African American men and women by law enforcement, when our numbers in the population is smaller, but the contacts are more, there's something that we need to address. And some people want to get into the conversation, well, you don't even want to address the Black on Black crime. That's not the conversation that we're having. The conversation we're having is our law enforcement officers' contacts with community members of African American descent, of Latina descent, of Native American descent, and how you can have someone who's being nonviolent being shot 3 and 4 times in the back. That's an issue. How you can have someone apprehended who's Caucasian, who just committed murder in a church, who's then given a meal before he's taken into custody. There's something wrong with that.
There absolutely. It seems like it has just never been more important for us, and I will say, especially as a white person, to start listening, just listening to what those experiences are and how they are disproportionately affecting people who don't look like me. And that is not something I want to know that is happening. That's not something I want to try to explain to my daughter, that, this is how things are, and that we just sat with it and we're okay, instead of hearing that entire communities of people are hurting, and that we could have done something better.
Yeah. And I think that what we're seeing is not only America protesting, we're seeing our world as a whole, Paris, all around the globe, people are protesting and saying enough is enough. And in order to really make change, there has to be the acknowledgement of the issues and how deeply rooted these issues are for them to be faced.
I couldn't agree more. Our time is nearing its end, and I know you wanted to mention a little bit about the Legal Defense Fund.
So the NAACP is an organization that is set up where we have our Legal Defense Fund, and the Legal Defense Fund is kind of where the movie Marshall highlights Thurgood Marshall and how he was able to travel around and do cases because of the Legal Defense Fund. So that's separate and apart from, it comes under the NAACP's umbrella, but it's a separate entity of the NAACP. So I wanted to make sure that that was also, since pretty much in 1909 is the pivotal year in which that was established. And that was one of the original reasons why the NAACP was established, was to get actions and to be able to go in and take actions in court. Again, our Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, was a key pivotal part of our Legal Defense Fund and our legal department. Currently, our legal department has active cases, and it's for basically changing things on a national level. Brown v. Board of Education, all of those things, and understanding that it was a Brown 1 and a Brown 2, but civil rights legislation and civil rights laws through the courts, our Legal Defense Fund addresses. On a local level, we have a legal redress committee in which we have the ability to investigate different complaints that come to us with limited number of volunteers. But a lot of times if it isn't an issue that our national has authorized, then we have to refer people out to local attorneys to assist them with those issues. But we do investigations and issue letters in cases where they need to be issued, and one of which will be coming soon on our COVID-19 educational disparities that are existing because of the differences, again, as I mentioned, about the vital communications, access to Wi-Fi, access to the internet. When the libraries are closed down, people went to the libraries before to use the computers to use the Wi-Fi. In Kitsap County, the libraries are now hotspots around the county so that people can go. But again, you got to go in a car, So there's a lot of limitations and factors that kind of affect our vulnerable populations because of COVID, because of what's happening. And it allows for us to be able to let the public see that all of these things are linked to systemic
I
crime.
imagine that you're going about your life at the beginning of this year. You're keeping everything going. Then COVID happens and you're like, okay, pivot, got to figure out how to do things online, got to figure out how to connect our community and keep things going. And then the next, as I said before, the racial pandemic starts happening and getting a ton of necessary movement.
Yes.
And now you're really running. Now you're like at a dead sprint, I imagine, every day.
Well, I said rollerblades. I feel like I'm on rollerblades.
I can only imagine, Tracy. I would like to ask you, what is giving you hope right now? what is it that is helping you get through the day, keep that momentum to be doing the work?
It's really hard, but what I see that's different now than in our past civil rights movement was we saw students through SNCC, the SNCC, as well as we saw the bus boycotts. We saw a lot of things. And it was heartbreaking to see. And it's heartbreaking to see when the tear gas is used on peaceful protesters. But it's positive to see the many cultures that have supported the Black Lives Matter movement, the faces that are more than just Black faces. And that's throughout the US and outside of the US. And I think that that's put a different lens on things. But I also want people to remember that it's important to not only protest, but it's important to know and to hear what is actually needed for transformation, because we need a transformation. So I have hope.
I would just assume that you would have to, Tracy, because otherwise I don't know how you get up out of bed every day and do the work that needs to be done. You need something to put gas in your own tank.
Oh, yeah.
Going. Well, we'll be putting up the website here, so you can go see the local NAACP website where you can get involved. You mentioned there are meetings on the fourth Monday of every month. So obviously we encourage everyone to be involved as much as they would like to be.
Yes.
And I will just like to give you the final word. What is it that you would like to say to the citizens of Kitsap County?
There's been many that have asked, how can you help? What can you do? And I would say educate yourselves beyond Facebook posts. Educate yourselves beyond CNN, Fox. Read as many books as you can. And this is where it's so important. I grew up with a card catalog where you went to the library and you touched the books. Many have gotten to the ebooks and all of that, but read the new Jim Crow. Read books that give you a different perspective, and be open to a different perspective. You don't know what an individual's been through just by looking at them. It's been difficult throughout my career and many African American women's careers, because if you say too much, you're judged and you're seen as the angry Black woman. But there has to come a time where you recognize how many missing Black girls are actually out there. Why is that? Let's come together and be willing to learn from one another. Come to an NAACP meeting, fourth Mondays. Right now we're meeting via Zoom. The information is on our website, and it links to our Facebook page, which gives you the Zoom links. And also give and support other Black businesses. There are donation buttons on our NAACP website. And we are looking all the time for new members, new committee members. That's one way to help and support us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Tracy, and taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with us. And thank you for the good work you're doing in the Kitsap community. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you. And I thank you for your invitation to be here to share with our community.